Well, I have finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I have many thoughts. So it's time to vomit out some of those thoughts onto the internet. I'll be avoiding spoilers as much as possible, especially story spoilers, but I will be touching on some elements that, if you're as spoiler sensitive as I am, you might not want to hear about if you haven't played the game yet. I personally avoided all reviews and pre-release videos regardless of how spoiler-free they were. I didn't seek out anyone's opinions, I didn't even play the demos because I wanted to go in completely clean. So if you're the same, I absolutely get why you might not want to watch this video. Okay, with that out of the way, I'll start by summarising my overall opinion. And that is, Rebirth is undeniably a great game. I loved it, for about 90% of my time playing it. The other 10% of the time, though, consisted mainly of frustration and disappointment. I came away from the game with many complicated and perhaps controversial opinions, but my overall perspective might be best summed up like this. Playing Rebirth really made me appreciate Final Fantasy XVI's relatively tight narrative and streamlined gameplay all the more. I'm not saying that FF16 is a better game, or even that I prefer it, but it definitely makes some choices that I wish Rebirth had also made. I know that runs contrary to what a lot of people have said, that Rebirth does things that 16 should have, and they're not necessarily wrong. But I personally think the reverse is also true. By any objective measure though, Rebirth is an amazing game. For one thing, it's huge, in terms of both its incredible open world and the rollercoaster of a narrative that it follows. Despite the ambitious scope though, almost everything still feels well polished and thoughtfully designed. From the bustling, lively town that you start out in, to the moment you first set foot into the wider world beyond, through a vast and varied array of environments and climates and settlements and geographic wonders, everything has been crafted with immense care. It's not the biggest, widest, most unrestricted game world ever created, nor is it the most densely packed with intricate detail, but it's always fun and interesting to explore, and it's perfectly suited to this style of game and the type of story it tells. And there's so much stuff to do in it. FF16 was criticised by some for its lack of side content, and that's a valid criticism even if I personally didn't mind its absence and thought that the side quests that were present were underrated by many. For me, side quests and minigames in Final Fantasy have always been a nice bonus rather than an essential feature. Well, Rebirth has enough side content to satisfy even the most demanding of fans. A lot of it is just generic open world fluff, special combat encounters, treasure troves, even that grand old cliche of open world games, climbable towers that populate your map with yet more location markers. They make an appearance too. It's not all super interesting, but it does at least give you an excuse to roam around the map, ticking things off your checklist. A lot of it though is very interesting indeed. Some of the side quests in particular are really rather cool. Like I suggested earlier, I like the FF16 side quests, particularly the ones that contributed to the greater narrative, but the side quests in Rebirth are undeniably more varied and more involved. They're also a big improvement over the rather restricted side quests we saw in Remake. As for the minigames, well, they're more of a mixed bag. You might have heard how popular the card game Queen's Blood is, and I think the hype is justified. It's simpler and more accessible than a lot of similar card games like Gwent or Triple Triad, which is a good thing as far as my feeble brain is concerned. I think it might be a little too dependent on luck to be a true classic, but it's still a lot of fun. As for most of the other minigames though, I didn't really get a lot out of them. They add a lot of charm and character to the world, and it's cool to see the way the main cast interact with them, but I personally was happy to play most of them once and then never again. The fact is, most of them play like very simple versions of other games, and if I wanted to play those other games, well, I would. I'm not encouraged to spend more time with them just because they're inside another game that I love. I guess achievement hunters and people who like to max out all their items and stats might feel differently. Fortunately, most of that stuff is optional. There are a few minigames that you're required to participate in to progress the story, but they're not too much of a trial. There are some gameplay elements though that are very much mandatory and which I found to be truly irritating. Rebirth almost seems to have an obsession with cramming in as much gameplay variety as possible, and while I respect the ambition, it just sometimes feels so very unnecessary. Case in point, very near the start of the game you're presented with a door that won't open until you clear out the Mako fumes in the area. To do this, you have to drag a large industrial vacuum cleaner over several different locations on the floor. The area you have to cover isn't large, but you can only move very slowly while dragging the object, and it's awkward to position it properly. In itself, this isn't a big deal. It's done in less than a minute and then the door opens. But this is only the first of many occasions where you'll have to do something similar, from dragging crates around to be able to climb to higher places, to throwing boxes into a furnace to power up an elevator, to dragging around yet more crates to block off wind currents so you can pass by safely. It got to the point where every time I saw a movable object I took a deep sigh because I knew I was going to be spending at least a little time slowly shuffling around, shoving something heavy from one side of the room to the other. And there's a lot about this game that is slower than it should be. There was a bit of a controversy about the notorious yellow paint making its way into a Final Fantasy game. That whole subject is something else I have complex opinions about, but in this game at least it's not a terrible thing. It's not overused, it really is just a visual cue to show you where you can go. And in a game that's not about fancy platforming or navigational puzzles, that's fine. What's not fine though is how long it takes Cloud and his friends to traverse those yellow rocks. They carefully swing from rock to rock, and you have to point them precisely in the direction of the next one to get them to move. Like the movable objects, it got to the point where I'd roll my eyes when I saw a whole bunch of yellow rocks, because I knew that a sudden halt to the game's momentum was about to occur. And that really is the key problem. No game has to be snappy and fast-paced all the time, but given the dramatic, often urgent nature of Rebirth's narrative, having to spend 5 minutes navigating from one side of the room to the other can be a real momentum killer. And sometimes the pacing problem is much bigger. There are times when some drastic event has just taken place and you're really excited to find out what's going to happen next, and the game throws you into a dungeon or a factory or a tower or whatever, some large environment that you have to get through, usually full of slow-paced crate pushing or rock climbing. It can really drain away any sense of urgency. Now, I'm not saying that these sections feel like unnecessary padding or that they are intolerably slow, although I do think we could do with a lot fewer occasions where your movement speed is reduced to a literal crawl. These areas are as well crafted as anything else in the game, it's just their placement and their impact on the overall pace of the game that can be a real issue. And for me, these pacing problems really were an issue, probably the biggest in the game. I know that not everyone will feel them as keenly as I did though. Like I said, I'm pretty sensitive to spoilers, so I really wanted to get through the game as soon as I could in order to minimise that risk. If you were less worried about that and more prepared to take the game at a leisurely pace, then you might not have minded these issues so much. But even with that being the case, I do believe the narrative thrust is often dulled by unnecessarily slow sections. In a way, the game is a victim of its own successes. If the narrative had been less compelling, it wouldn't have been so annoying to be slowed down. And I do really want to stress that this is only sometimes a problem. There are plenty of sections of the game that have really nothing to do with the main narrative that could be seen as a waste of time, but they're actually my absolute favourite parts of the game, largely because they are well placed in the ebb and flow of the overall story. Honestly, the goofiest, most random moments are some of the best. I don't want to spoil any of them, but if you remember the dance number at the Honeybee Inn from Remake, you'll have some idea of what to expect. But not a complete idea, because they've upped the goofy factor substantially in Rebirth. Seriously, by God have they committed to the bit. They've taken the goofiness very seriously. There are dance numbers and humorous set pieces that have had just as much diligent attention to detail put into them as any of the dramatic scenes or combat sequences, and it all works so well. I applauded FF16 for maintaining a consistent, mature tone, but I applaud Rebirth just as much for going in a completely different direction. It really just proves that Square Enix can pull off pretty much anything, because no matter what they do it with the utmost love and care. And the serious parts of the narrative are brilliant too, with a few exceptions. The overarching narrative, the quest to track down Sephiroth, is very strong, and more than enough to keep you motivated throughout. I won't say too much about it, other than I think it's a great adaptation of the original, without being so faithful that it becomes boring or predictable. And there are one or two moments in there that I found as emotionally devastating as anything in any Final Fantasy game, which is really saying something. Fans of the original game might think they know what I'm talking about, but actually no, you don't. I'll say no more. However, there are also certain sections of the story that have suffered in the adaptation this time around, I think. With Remake, I thought they handled everything nigh on perfectly in terms of adaptation from the original, but with Rebirth they've made some choices that I don't think really work. Again, I can't go into too much detail without encroaching on spoiler territory, but there were definitely some moments I remember fondly from the original, and that I was really looking forward to seeing in Rebirth, that left a somewhat bitter taste in my mouth. Don't get me wrong, there was nothing that was too bad, nothing that ruined a story beat or a moment or a character. There were just a few elements that I wish had been done a bit differently. And in a game of this scope, that's to be expected. There was so much to adapt, it can't have been an easy task. And as the middle game in a trilogy, Rebirth was always going to have a particularly difficult job in terms of maintaining the narrative thrust. The start and the end are always going to go a certain way, but there's so much in between to account for, no one's going to love everything about it, and ultimately they've done a great job of modernising it. Back in '97, the original game seemed like an incredible achievement, vast and full of life. Standards have obviously changed in the intervening decades, but Rebirth manages to capture that same feel, and that's no mean feat. There is one particular way that I think Rebirth suffers from being the middle part of a trilogy though, and that's in the character of Cloud. The fact is, at this point in the story, Cloud is not a very interesting central character. He has a fantastic character arc, but it's one that takes place over the whole of the original game, and here in the middle section I really just don't find him that compelling. He doesn't have much to say about anything, he just doesn't have much of a personality. Knowing the full story, there's a reason for that, and this game does a lot to inject a bit of intrigue into his character, raising questions over just how much he's being influenced by Sephiroth, but I'll put it this way. The tenuous love triangle between Cloud, Aerith and Tifa just seems a bit implausible to me in Rebirth because, really? Cloud is the guy who ignites so many emotions? There just doesn't seem to be enough to him. In the shipping wars, I'm kind of the opinion that Aerith and Tifa could both do better. Fortunately, all the other characters are fantastic. Barrett, Tifa and Aerith continue to grow as characters, as do their relationships with each other. The friendship between Tifa and Aerith in particular is great to see. Red 13 really comes into his own in this game, he has so much personality. Yuffie, the closest thing the game has to a comic relief character, is genuinely hilarious at times but also incredibly endearing. And the other new party member, who I guess might be a spoiler for people who haven't played the original, is also much more charming and interesting than I expected. In a game full of characters, these characters still have so much character. Sorry, that sentence made no sense. But you know what I mean. Now on to the combat. I've said in the past that I don't really care that much about combat in Final Fantasy games. As long as it's not actively irritating or overbearingly tedious, I'll basically be okay with it. In the case of Rebirth though, I actually have strong opinions about the combat, and that's because it comes close to being the best in any FF game, but ends up falling flat. In my opinion at least, and this is one area where I know I am greatly at odds with many other fans who unreservedly love the combat in Rebirth. I really wish I could agree. All the elements are there. You have many varied tools at your disposal, different characters bring different things to the table, you have numerous offensive, defensive and strategic options. You're rewarded for proper positioning and well-timed blocking. The newly added synergy attacks open up whole other avenues for both offense and defense. There are so many things to think about and strategies to devise, it's great. But too often the combat seems devised to unnecessarily complicate things and restrict your actions. I think it mostly comes down to the way the enemies tend to move too quickly and too randomly for you to be able to keep up with them. Very often an attack will miss because an enemy scooted away from it at the last moment, after you've committed to it, without giving any indication that it was about to do so. Airborne enemies are particularly irritating in this regard, and there are a lot of them. Some enemies will change stances in the middle of a fight, rendering them immune to a spell you've just cast. This is exacerbated by the way the ATB system works. You need to build up your ATB gauge to do pretty much anything, and the best way to do this is by normal attacks or defending. And that's fine in theory, but very often an enemy will be out of range of a character's normal attacks or simply immune to them. Yes, this does force you to think about other options, but too many times have I found myself really needing to heal or use an item. The enemy is immune to normal attacks, or worse, counters them automatically. It also doesn't help that, left to their own devices, non-player controlled characters build ATB very slowly. The new synergy attacks help greatly with that, and they're a very welcome addition, but even so I felt starved of ATB more times than was fun. Skill issue? To some extent, no doubt. The thing is though, I played most of the game on dynamic difficulty, and it wasn't particularly tough. In fact, I'd say the balance was pitched very well. The combat just wasn't as fun as when I switched to easy mode and just started murdering everything. That said, easy mode is still too easy. I got many complaints when I suggested that about Remake on Twitter, but I'm prepared to reiterate it here. Despite what some people think, easy mode should not allow you to bypass pretty much every mechanic. Things should still be able to kill you, they should just have to work a bit harder to do it. But I spent from having to heal practically every 10 seconds on dynamic difficulty to literally never having to heal again on easy mode. Ultimately, I think the combat stands on an uneasy middle ground between turn-based and action-focused. The pure action combat of 16 was definitely too easy and too simple, but I still had more fun with it than I did in Rebirth. Conversely, if Rebirth had gone full-on turn-based and made ATB build over time like it did in the original, it could have been my favourite FF combat ever. I know that's kind of an unworkable proposition to have turn-based combat in a game that's otherwise so dynamic, but personally, I would have been okay with that. There are times when the combat works really well and seems to flow perfectly fine. mainly in boss fights where you're fighting only one enemy and are able to focus on it completely. But whenever there are multiple enemies or fast-moving enemies that flit about the arena at random, it just gets too irritating to be fun. Well, that's most of what I have to say about Rebirth, or at least as much as I can say without getting into spoilers. I may do another video before too long that goes full on spoiler mode and gets into more details. For now though, I'm left to summarise my overall opinion on Rebirth. And ultimately, I did really love it. I hope I haven't seemed too negative here. I've brought up a lot of issues and they are genuine, but I have to admit that now I've finished the game, they don't seem as significant as they did while I was still in the middle of it all, and I'm left with almost entirely positive feelings. Certainly the positives outweigh the negatives enough that the negatives seem almost entirely insubstantial. And yet, if or when I come to replay Rebirth, I know there will be certain sections that I'll wish I could skip. But as a continuation of the epic adventures of Cloud, Aerith, Tifa and their companions, it's a massive success. And now the wait for the final installment begins. Until then though, get off my lawn.